official start of the takedown of socialism in America.
Thank you very much, David, for being with us today.
Thank you, Simone. Great to be here.
Okay. You know, this coronavirus epidemic has really exposed some of America's supply chain vulnerabilities. For example, 80% of the key ingredients of our generic drugs are produced in China. So if China stopped producing, America will have a problem.
Right.
Can you give me a sense of the scope of this problem and how we get there, how we get here?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's amazing because that's just one example that extends across every industry. And so the smartest people in the world supposedly all go to Harvard Business School, right? And the first thing you learn in undergrad at Liberty University, where I'm the dean of business, is diversification, and don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? In stock portfolio picking, etc. That's the first basic principle. And so what have our MBAs coming out of Harvard and all the elites that run all the Fortune 500s done? They've put the U.S. in a position where 85–90% of our pharmaceutical active ingredients are tied up, basically kind of in a monopoly position underneath a communist regime. What could go wrong? Well, what just went wrong? And then some of the experts who know better are calling this, black swan, reminiscent of the 2008 financial crisis. And that's not really accurate either. A black swan is a completely unpredictable event, very hard to forecast. This is not, right? The Soviet Union, we knew in time would crack. Then Japan was going to overtake us. And they had a banking crisis because they had the government mixed in with their banking too much. And so China's going to crack for the same reason that they are cracking right now. The lack of information flows across market. You can sustain that for a decade or two, but not forever. You cannot ignore the price system. And that's what free markets work for a reason. And rich countries become rich. So China's forced the issue. And now in the United States, everybody gets the idea that, in order to be free, you have to have laws. There's no freedom without the rule of law to protect your private property rights and your freedoms in the Constitution. And so the same thing applies at the global level. So now it's a question of there are no international norms. The U.S. set up the international norms after World War II with Bretton Woods system and the World Bank and IMF and the United Nations. And that order worked very well. Peace, prosperity, Western Europe got rich with us. We made friends with our arch enemies, right? The Nazis, the Germans, the Japanese were our enemies. Now they're our friends. But then here comes China. And they're not playing by these fair rules of the game, right? Reciprocity. If they want to send students here, we should be able to send students there. If they want to be in our index fund, we should get to be in their index fund. If they want to be on our New York Stock Exchanges, we should get to be in the middle of them. If they want to play media, they should have a free media and Google and all that stuff in China, and they do not. And so that's the big question that will affect supply chains, because if we don't have an international set of norms, everyone in the U.S. is just prone to cheat. It's kind of a prisoner's dilemma, game theoretical. Everybody knows China has had the growth, and so the U.S. kind of tapped out. So all U.S. firms were naturally wanted to go to China to capture that growth. And they were being unprincipled and making deals they should not have made. And so now, unfortunately, it's going to take a tragedy for us to learn those lessons. We can still be friends with the Chinese people are great, but the party runs the government and the party runs the military. And I don't think the average American knows that yet. So 1.4 trillion people created in the image of God are being run by 50 people. And we don't like that. And so we got to figure out, hey, what's some fair rules of the game that are going to make the Chinese people better off and have a win-win, and the supply chain is going to be part of that fix.
I think we are in real dilemma right now, because on one hand, China is the second largest economy, has a huge market, and has a booming economy. But on the other hand, we had this history of capitalism has not been able to stand up to the communists, and we have not been immune to the communist ideologies. So it's been the Chinese being exporting their ideologies to us instead of we exporting ideology to them. So how do you solve this dilemma? On one hand, you want to capture this profit instead of...
Yeah. Well, President Trump is the first president in about 30 years to take a stand at all. And he's taken a pretty tough stand. But he's got a friendly stance, but then operationally, he's getting things done to make some fixes. But it's mainly involved tariffs. And so tariffs, it sounds big, it's on the news every night, but it's probably, 100 billion up to 500 billion. The real power is in the international capital flows going across the world. And that's in the tens of trillions of dollars. And so we can easily solve the problem, right? You tell China what the new rules of the game are. For their capital to flow, they have to trade in dollars. We can fix that real quick if we wanted to. But are we willing to solve the problem? And we've been playing our own economy with funny money, right? We got $4 trillion on the Federal Reserve balance sheet. That's a sugar high. We're running $1 trillion government budget deficits every year. That's a sugar high. That's fake. And so everybody, we cannot afford to get sick, to use a terrible metaphor at this time, but the U.S. economy is shaky already. It's strong, but it's artificially grounded. So are we going to stand up to China, who's a source of growth, and say, look, you got to start playing fair, and if you do not, we will cut you off of the international capital flow market, the New York Stock Exchange, our index funds. And the Chinese are very smart, right? If they get to a point where the average American has 20, 30% of your retirement account invested in China, then if we ever have to do policy, right, to get China policy right, the average American's going to say, right, you're messing with my retirement. And the Chinese know that. And so we have a short run period here, right? I'd say within 5 years, we better get this right, because our average person makes $50,000 a year, and the average Chinese makes about $9,000 a year. Well, they're growing, so say they become like us and make $50,000 a year. That'll bring their economy to a $150 trillion economy. And right now we're at 20. So that right now we got to get the rules of the game set so we both win, right? It's not medieval economics where you want the other guy to hurt. We want them to do well, but they got to play fair, and they're not at all right now.
Wall Street and the institutional investors in the U.S., they are not in the mood to change that.
No.
So that's the problem.
That's the problem.
Yeah. Right. So how do you, I know, for example, Senator Marco Rubio has this legislation, but it's not moving forward faster enough. Right. So my question is really, you asked, do we have the motive? I'm going to ask you, do we have the motive? And where does the motive come from? It's not coming from the Wall Street.
No, and so Wall Street just cannot learn, right? So President Trump won the presidency last time on a populist campaign, going straight to the people. And it was called the forgotten man and woman. They know Wall Street's left them behind. They know Washington, D.C. is a bunch of rent seekers and crony capitalists, and the whole city's bought and paid for, right? There's cranes all over D.C. right now. You look out the window. There's not cranes across the American Midwest. And now, 4 years later, there's a populist revolution going on the Democratic side with Bernie. So both sides have a populist revolution, and if Wall Street doesn't see this coming, they will learn, right? So they can hold out and keep this crony game going and propping up the billionaires or whatever, but the people are watching now. They know Wall Street's playing games. The Republicans have been playing kind of softball. The Democrats are playing hardball. Elizabeth Warren, if she gets her way, and Bernie wants another $90 trillion, over $60 trillion government, with 51% government workers, federal government workers in his plan, right? So Wall Street better wake up, and their own self-interest is to do the right thing right now. And that includes doing the right thing with China. So will they listen to this sermon? I don't know. I hope they do.
So you think Wall Street will eventually wake up, or this force will actually come from the American people, from the grassroots, which way, or both?
Yes. Well, and this pandemic is going to speed that process up. right? When the American people do the math and the calculations and figure out what our government has not done in providing safety for them and global rules of the game, fair practices by China, I hope we don't have to learn in a terrible hard way, but this coronavirus thing is going to speed up that process tremendously. I was on the budget committee in the Congress, and we're running $1 trillion deficits every year. That's not sustainable. That'll bankrupt you eventually. But no one knows. And I wish the American people knew and would act on that basis.
What do you mean no one knows?
The media doesn't cover it, right? They want the left, the mainstream media in the U.S. wants ongoing government growth and spending, and the mainstream media in the U.S. is tied in with the Democrat Party, right? Look at CNN. Constantly on the attack against the president, constantly propping up Biden and Warren. They don't want Bernie either, right? So they're propping up the billionaire class, keeping all the money safe. They don't want Bernie to crack it open. And so, we have an opportunity right here to get the word out. But the average person, if you ask them what's the U.S. debt, it's $22 trillion. No one knows, right? And if our Social Security system and our Medicare system for the elderly is bankrupt by 2034, for sure. Insolvent. No one knows that, right? And so we've got to re-educate the American people. Our K-12 education system isn't doing any of this. And so we're just asleep. We become rich. We're very rich, very powerful, but we're sleeping.
Mm-hmm. Like you said, the coronavirus epidemic has really pushed things fast.
Yes.
And before this, I was worried about the Phase 1 trade deal with China.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at the trade deal itself, on the surface, it's all China needs to do this,
right.
China needs to do that.
Right.
America doesn't need to do anything because we're already in this way. So on the surface, it's all good for America. But I think essentially what this trade deal does is just engage, connect the two economies.
Right.
Even more.
Right.
And I think, what's your opinion now with this coronavirus epidemic? Do you think this trade deal will be disrupted? And what's the way forward?
Yeah. Well, it's going to be tricky now because China has quarantined populations of 50 million people. And so that'll have a tremendous impact on the global economy and global growth. And if China slows down, that's going to be severe pain, right? And we're leaving out, sub-Saharan Africa. The poorest people in the world are tied in with China's Belt and Road policies, which, in my view, those were not going to be helpful in the long run to the sub-Saharan African countries. And so now it's going to be a key time to be very careful with diplomacy. We don't want to damage China to the extent that the global order comes down, right? And the growth, because that'll hurt everybody. And the health concerns will hurt, right? If they own 80-90% of the masks, and then the globe needs them and they keep them all, everybody gets it kind of common sense, right?
Before we establish our own supply chain,
right.
manufacturing,
that'll
we have
take a year probably, right? And so that's the question, this just-in-time inventory issue. It's very efficient, but how many months of supplies do we have? 1 month, 3 months, 6 months? That no one has a firm grasp of that issue, but that's the answer to the risk.
Okay, so I think before the coronavirus epidemic, a lot of people are talking about the U.S. economy and Chinese economy disengage.
Right.
And I think it's almost a political incorrect thing to say. The two economies should disengage.
Right.
But like President Ronald Reagan has said, communism is like a virus.
Right.
And I think with a virus, you have two ways to deal with it. So one, you kill it. Another, you stay away from it.
Right.
So what is your thought on, the two economies? Should we engage? Should we decouple?
Yeah. Well, and you set up before, like at first glance, it looks like we're making these demands upon China, and it looks one way. But if you set up the criteria, I taught ethics for 20 years, so when you got to set up what is the criteria for fairness, right? And so if China has been more unfair over the past 20 years, which I would argue they have in terms of intellectual property theft and patent stuff, you know, the US has been the engine of the world on the patent front and innovation, and China copies, replicates it, makes it cheaper and gets rich. Well, okay, I mean, if you fool us, you know, that many times in a row, that's on us. But this decoupling, I think President Trump and the administration, they do have to name what are the criteria for fairness, and if China won't abide by that, we do have to decouple. In the short, I don't want it to be a long run thing, but in the short run, if you do not take a firm stand now, I mentioned a $150 trillion economy in 10, 20 years if China runs it out, right? And then China in 2049, if they want to have their celebration, does that include possessing Taiwan? And I've heard generals speak on that issue, and they say America has 15-year amnesia, right? We forget things like even Tiananmen in 15 years. We forget about...
More like 30 years.
Yeah, 30 years. And if that's what it is, then China's got to take Taiwan before then. So that's in the next 20 years. And then that raises serious issues. Are we going to allow that to happen and block the seaways where 40% of global trade goes through those seaways? We cannot let that happen. And it's not good for the globe. It's not good for China long run. So we just have to be very clear and very good. It's a moral question, more than economic. It's a moral question. Moving forward, how is the order we establish good for both peoples? China, US, Europe, everybody. And we should have a system that's win-win for everybody. But if China says no to it, then we got to play hardball for a little bit.
For a moment.
Yeah.
Decouple for a moment.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So how many people are thinking like you in the Washington circle?
Yeah. Well, it was unheard of, right, until President Trump won. And everyone was just self-interested. They just wanted to make profits in the short run. And so now President Trump comes on the scene, puts policy in place, awakens everybody to issues, serious issues, national security issues with China and the rest of the world, the sea lanes, the South China Sea and all that, the islands being constructed, weapon systems being stolen. And now everybody, oh, yeah, well, now we're kind of aware of that. All the think tanks in D.C. that were asleep, right? They're finally waking up. So they'll admit to it a little bit. They'll go along with it passively, just not to be embarrassed. But do they really believe it? And I don't think so.
Okay.
So it's going to take a while.
So you think it will take some major, like even bigger event for them to wake up?
Yes.
Like for
It's amazing. I know.
For example, what?
It's a lot of it comes down, what are people living for? If you're living for money, and if there's a lot of interest vested in China growth, and your firm is vested in there, for you to say no to prosperity for you and your family, that takes some guts. How many people you want to live at that level of ethics or morality? We'll see.
Would you say the force will come from the American people?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the hope.
This virus is going to wake up every mom and dad across the country, right? Because when it goes to your family security and your little kid and their safety, all of a sudden, right, everyone's going to get it real quick. So the moral compass will be, I think in the next year, there's going to be some fundamental changes.
I want to ask you some general, big picture questions.
Sure.
What do you think is the most critical issue that America faces today?
I think it's being in touch with first principles. All the principles that made us great as a country, we were set up under Judeo-Christian principles. And James Madison, who wrote the Constitution of the United States, went to Princeton Seminary. And most of the great philosophers in the history of thought, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and the Enlightenment guys, Immanuel Kant and all these folks, human nature's not good. And if human nature's not good, we're not a bunch of angels, then you separate power. You keep a small federal government, you separate power from the executive and the judiciary and the legislative, you separate power between the federal and the state and the local. We did that. Very successful. And so we have to get back in touch with that reality And all the founders said, this republic, this experiment we had is founded on the assumption that we are a morally good people, that we're a moral people. And we got to get back to that. We are K-12, for the first 13 years of student life here in the US, we don't teach any religion, no ethics, no right and wrong, no Confucian, no nothing, right? And so China knows that. You have to, right? Yeah, right. No, right. We got fake stuff now, right? And we say the word ethics. There's no such thing as ethics, right? There's Confucian ethics, there's Christian ethics, there's Kantian academic ethics, right? But there's no just ethics. And so the people that are throwing that out, it's just meaningless. So that shows you we have a cultural problem right now, and we've got to get back to the basics.
Okay. So do you think, at American, I think freedom, liberty is at the center of America's value. But do you think America can achieve true liberty without faith?
I don't think so in the long run, right? And so in the U.S. right now, the young culture is flirting with Bernie Sanders and socialism and this kind of thing. And the communist ideology and Marx, and then the new Marxist theorists of the 1960s have put everyone at war with each other. It used to be, the capitalists versus the workers. And now Marx has been redefined into antagonism between men and women and black and white and Asian or whatever. It's a war of group against group. Well, that won't work. And so the faith does matter, right? If you don't believe that all people are created by God, all people are endowed by their Creator and are entitled to human rights as individuals. And that comes from the faith. It comes from a faith. Right? You're going to have to name it.
Liberty comes from faith.
From faith, right. Liberty in the West clearly came out of that Judeo-Christian tradition. Early on, the freedom of conscience in theology, right? If God wanted everybody, He could have made robots. But God didn't He gave us all freedom. And so you're free to choose, and that ought to be respected. And so, I think the faith is very tied to concepts of American liberty. And now liberty is also being confused with just libertine. You can do anything you want. And that's not, it was the founders of this country, it was a reasoned liberty. And now the left in U.S. universities has a war on reason as well. Alistair McIntyre is a famous Aristotelian philosopher. His book summarizes it, and he's one of the top 10 philosophers in the country. Whose justice, which rationality? Questioning reason altogether. And so, I hate to be a pessimist, but we got a lot of work to do.
Do you believe there exists an existential threat to America in terms of its identity?
Yes. Yes.
Who we are and what we stand for?
Absolutely. Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And do you think the American people today, is it still possible for the American people today to go back to the ways that our founding fathers designed? Yeah.
I mean, I've been around to Europe and other countries, and there is a deep ethos that's still alive, the Judeo-Christian tradition, love your neighbor as yourself, right? The golden rule. Well, that did not exist in Greece, with the Greeks. That did not exist in Rome. That love came at zero into the Western lexicon, right? The Jewish people had love too, right? But the love as a key virtue came about in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And now love is just this, be happy, eat sugar and be on a sugar high. That's not love. Love in our tradition is hard. It's disciplined. It takes commitment to your family.
Human desire.
Yes, right. Right. That's not true love. Concern for other people. So we got a lot of homework to get back to the basics.
But you think we
still I think it's embedded deep within people, even if they can't articulate it. But we got to bring the language back. If you can't articulate it, that's a problem. Right.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Simone. Great.